I wanted to give a talk about a very different topic, a topic of non-technical topic. If you are a designer, if you know a designer, I want you to talk to them, bring them in and show them the video once we have it published, or start this conversation. You don't need to show my video, you can talk to them yourself. Before we go into speed design specifically, let's revamp why speed matters. I think that the previous team did a very good job, but I want to dive into a few different motivations that might work for different people on your team. I try to collect those kinds of motivations because that's kind of rust. Maybe you see that, like, that's the main job we do. We try to motivate people to do performance, right? And with different people, different things work, right? So this is the very first chart ever existed of correlating performance data with conversion rate. And for those who are not familiar, basically how many users end up buying whatever you have to sell. In this case, it's e-commerce, so it's a very dollar-centric metric, but conversion can apply to any interactivity, right? So it can be ad clicks, or button presses, or navigations to the right page, and stuff like that. But this was the first chart, and you can clearly see how conversion drops down and then plateaus as the speed of, during those days we only had one metric called load time, compared to load time, right? And it applies to many other any other metric actually. So like this shape generally with conversion plateauing and log normal distribution for your speed based metric is normal, right? So basically, the more people you have to the left, the more people will convert, basically, right? They will enjoy higher conversion rates. So if you're talking to a person with a business degree, very good metric, especially in e-commerce. It's not always e-commerce shops, so WPO Stats that I mentioned before collects a lot of these use cases, right? Definitely read it up. Read up all the use cases, especially for the industry that you had, like, I'm not going to quote many, right? But specific improvement in speed cost this much more money, right? Or we had some revenue numbers, we had some bounce rates, which can effectively be converted to effectiveness of marketing campaigns, session time for Tokopedia, like for them it was important metric, and so on. So check out these stats because basically this will help you in business conversations. We just talked about corporate vitals a few years ago when Google announced it. Is it 4 already? It's that long. Like we have such a great push from Google, so it's very likely that you're talking to a SEO team as well. And for them, these 3 numbers are like a holy grail, right? So pay attention to that. Definitely, it helped us only talk about performance metrics, and they know it matters because Google told them to, right? Basically, they're like, well, that matters. You folks fix it, right? Again, you should never have that little simple stance on the topic, but still, this can help you quite a bit, right? Basically, you want Google's benefit, go do this, right? Another project by Tim Kadlec, it's called "What Does My Site Cost?" These are not costs for you as creator of the websites. These are costs for mobile users and cost of mobile data plans in those countries, as it relates to percent of a daily budget. So in this particular case, Disney.com homepage in Mauritania is 2.73% of daily budget for one page in mobile plans, right? And you would be surprised how in some cases, like the Canada is here in the top X list, right? Like you would think, again, this data might be a little old, but like, please check it out. Like, think of it this way. It's not only about like conversions, but also what it costs for the user, both in interactivity, as we talked about, mobile interactivity being more complicated, but also real money cost, right? If you ever want to talk, geek out on such numbers or some crazy outliers, like talk to Paul Kalman or to team, they find crazy stuff. Did anyone attend the font performance talk a couple months ago? Yeah, we had what, 713 fonts on one page? 713 fonts, so it exists. So kind of like, if you think, we are talking with established business today, right? Like with .-narrative. Probably not as many mistakes like that, but you can see a lot of unusual stuff. And think from user's perspective. And speaking of users, this is my little gluey version. We take away time from people's lives, right? Like each time it takes time, right? So you can calculate how many lifetimes it is. Right? If you have a popular website, right, what is it? 20 million page views, 10 seconds. Well, that's one lifetime. You take out one lifetime a year. It's literal math. I didn't do any statistics or magic or whatever. This is just multiplying what, you know. It's very simple, you know. So think of it this way, right? Like, I'm sure this is a little gloomy. Maybe that's the point of this website, right? But think of it this way, right? Like when we're talking about design, we want it to be pleasant for the user, right? Taking time out of their life is not pleasant, right? So why am I bringing it up? Why, like I'm an engineer. I'm not a designer, right? Like worked with designers my whole life, but I'm an engineer, and I feel that a lot of performance conversation is full of metrics, full of observability, full of engineering, full of testing, which by all means we all need. But I think what it's missing, maybe not fully missing, but it's having a hard time, is relating to the actual product. And I feel like we need to change the development life cycle and include performance earlier in it. Like sometimes people say it's a cycle, right? Like sometimes people say it's linear, right, per project. But in any case, I often see performance coming in after launch. At best, it comes in here, right, in beta test, right? And you're like, oh, we have slowness. But often I see after launch, we see slowness, and suddenly everybody goes and tries to fix performance. And that's obviously not good, right? During engineering, at our meetup, we talk a lot about technology, about how to improve performance, use this technique or that technique, and I hope we can bring that into this middle cycle, middle portion where we do improve performance, right? Hopefully this is taken care of. Well, I don't think it's taken care of, but hopefully we discuss it quite a bit, being engineers. But what I want to do is actually ask a question. What should performance be before engineers even look at the product, right? During the design sprints, during the product ideation cycles, like here there is actually not much. I mean, I guess user research is something, but in a previous slide we had the whole idea generation, right? Why can't performance drive that conversation, right? If not improvements, like Russ mentioned, the dollar amounts that you can make, right? You don't have to add a button to make money, you can remove a button to make money, right? If that's a business decision, please do that. But even if it's not that conversation, at least define what performance should be, right? And who will better to do that than, if not designers? And I don't need to do the rest of the presentation. I think the simple answer is pages don't appear immediately. That's it. That's just not happening. It's kind of logical, but it's not very common knowledge, you know. So do progressively enhance your page. Make sure you orchestrate how it shows up. In 2015, Ken Talstad, I forgot which company he was with at the time, well, Redware actually, gave a great presentation and had this amazing slide where he talks about the fact that today our designers create an oil painting, meaning the final look of the page, right? And instead, they should be short movie clips directors. They should define how the experience should show up, right? Because if they don't, then engineers will. And we all know how well engineers do directing and painting with paint and stuff, right? Sorry, I have to say that. Some of us are pretty good at art as well. But effectively, you need to be prescriptive about how you want things to show up as a designer. Tim Cadlick, who I mentioned earlier, also gave a great talk about choreography of performance, and he looked at animators, for example, who used storyboarding to define the animation that will happen, and they care a lot about transitions between individual scenes or states. I mean, sometimes, by the way, these represent the full scene, but sometimes they like break down something very important, like specifically these storyboards. But even if we put storyboards aside, the fact that animators care a lot about speed of change on the screen, it reminds me of our work quite a lot. And that's what Tim talked about. I'm surprised he didn't give this talk more since, right? So, effectively reveal those features, right? Like think about this progression of your experience as the page loads. And yes, sure, you might need to talk to an engineer to understand a little bit about what happens, right? But even if you don't, like think of what you want to accomplish. For example, you can generally break up the whole experience into a few phases, right? Prioritize some things over the others, put, let's say, most important image on the page earlier, and maybe secondary reviews down on the page later, and stuff like that, right? This is a decision that you as a product manager and designer together you can make, right? Without necessarily even knowing what's the technological complexity. And instead of creating a mock-up that looks like the final page only, right? You can create incremental mock-ups and say, like, this is probably how I want my brand represented the very first moment we show up this page, right? I want my logo there for sure, right? Like I don't want it to be, I don't know, what is it? Netflix or whatever? It should be clear that it's YouTube, right? This is a business decision, not engineering decision, right? You can have, by the way, this screen does not show a huge gray area, which is hilarious. But basically, on my screen, this big area, it has darker background to indicate where the content will come, right? So basically, create the zones on the page. That might be problematic for further reading. Anyway, sorry. Technology challenge I didn't expect. Highlight the primary content and some basic main navigation, like where you are in the whole website. What is the primary content? What are alternative means of navigating? Like in this case, it's a search bar. What are the secondary navigation, secondary content, right? And maybe the rest of the content, like that login state that can come in later, right? The user knows it's there, right? Like they can look in the top right corner later, as long as they want to watch this clip, right? So formalize that and think about it as a designer. And if you are an engineer, help them think about it this way. And effectively, this becomes your wireframe, right? Like maybe product manager can think of it this way. They can help them prioritize, because designers don't always know what's most important, what's not. Product manager will definitely, right? And they can make these decisions, put them on the timeline, put some numbers there. Like, you know, they don't have to be real numbers because it's obviously just one number, not statistics. But you can inform some of this decision based on your statistics, right? What matters is put them on a timeline, create this storyboard, and then use Figma to create more developed, how do we call it, robust frames, robust sketches, or whatever, right? And pass this on to your developers so they don't need to guess what is that your intention is, right? They don't need to think where to slap the spinner on. They don't need to think about it. They know what you wanted to accomplish. And you can even create a video out of it, right? You know the timings. Yes, they're not real timings, but who cares if this can help you realize what's going on, right? By the way, the links are there. And then you can talk to your engineers, and maybe engineers can go and prioritize some technologies to accomplish each of these phases, right? Like, and again, I do a lot of measurement, I do a lot of talks about technical implementation. We can talk separately about it, but effectively you can create constraints for each of the phases, right? And you can basically establish the communication between designers and engineers about how things should be implemented, why Do you choose static generation versus single page application, client-side rendered, right? Like that, you know, things like that. Again, designers probably don't care too much about like the terminology, but they can care about when will they think show up. So, like, think about it from this progression perspective. And I will go and talk about a few design patterns. I call them speed patterns because they're speed design patterns that we are identifying and writing in this website called speedpatterns.com. More to come, but these few that I will talk about in detail, think of them as, well, you can use those and kind of literally, like, when you talk to a designer, hey, here's the design pattern. Like, just do this, right? Use this. But generally think of it as a way to discuss speed, right? Like, don't talk our tech speak, talk about the business and visual aspect of it. So the first one we call fast start. It's kind of the most obvious one because nothing shows up until something shows up, right? And I know, it's kind of funny to put it here, but not everyone understands that things take time to show up, right? Like, it's not as given to designers as it is to engineers, right? We just know too much, right? And sometimes it can be because of that back-end call, and for years we discussed about it. For years, our whole industry was thinking that it's a server problem, right? And again, it can be a server problem, it still exists today, right? But only if you measure, you know, right? But again, designers don't necessarily need to know about it, but generally they kind of need to understand that it takes time to show something, right? Something, not everything, something, right? But sometimes it can be not a server call. It can be like a lot of stuff, and your render actually happens at the very end, right? And in this case, like 147 milliseconds to get all CNN.com homepage in this test, the whole HTML, right? But almost 11 seconds to paint in it, right? So anyway, sorry, engineer took over. Like, I'm so excited about these inner workings that I forgot that it doesn't matter. In both cases, it was late. It just showed up late, right? So, fast start is something that product managers should demand. How we implement it doesn't matter. We'll solve it as engineers, right? But this should be a demand. Because bounce rates from their advertising, because of, you know, conversion rates further on, it's very obvious, right? They should be able to ask for it. A couple technical metrics that can help. FCP, not a core web vital, but one of the web vitals that Google provides the thresholds for. And LCP, as we discussed, it's the largest contentful paint. Oftentimes they are somewhat related, not always, but like these two metrics are something you want to care for. And again, if you need SEO support in this conversation, you just go to your SEO person and say, how fast should LCP be? And they're like, 2.5. The rest is shit, right? Like, basically, it's very hard for a designer to know how fast should the intro to their video be, right? Like, they don't know yet. They don't have that muscle that we as engineers in this space specifically develop to know the number, right? Anyway, the second pattern is so-called immutable layout. I gave it a name, maybe not the best name, but that's the best I figured out, right? So if you think about this page, like some content, right, very useful content, some times on the bottom, and then suddenly the advertising comes in, and, well, what's on tonight? I don't see it anymore. And this is just one example, but I can imagine you've seen this many, many times. Google gives amazing example of a person buying something instead of canceling the order because the button shifted right under their mouse in the right moment, right? So there are many reasons why this can happen, but keep your layout consistent across the user experience. And this should be demanded by designers and product managers. It should not be engineering achievement to think about it, right? So instead, allocate some space, and by the way, it should be gray right there, I don't know if you can see it. Allocate some space, because you know the ad, you will show the ad there. Yes, it will come from that automated bidding or whatever the system you use. It will eventually come. You cannot know it in advance, but you know that it will be there. Allocate that space, it will show up, no problem, right? You already gave up that space. Like there's no, you cannot do better. Shifting all your content to hide the fact that it's just not really good. So, very simple solution, right? Another core web vital, speaking of layout stability, right? Cumulative layout shift, which calculates how much your page moves around. The number is not seconds, it's actually percentages of the screen that moved throughout the page load. Doesn't matter. Like, measure it, know where you stand. Are you good? Are you poor? Do you need improvement? Basically, it's a good conversation supporter for that very visual discussion. Okay, the next one you probably heard of already. It's a pretty established one, and I'm glad it is, right? Like one thing we discovered is called skeletal designs. You might not have heard the term, however, but you'll know what I'm talking about shortly. So effectively the idea is that as you know that content will be showing up eventually, allocate some space for it, fix that layout, give people visual clues, and again the gray is not there. Like, there's enough gradient, like there's enough background here to show that the information will come here. As you can see, the image progresses from knowing where it will be to actually being there. Like the content, the labels for these boxes here clearly tell you what you will expect to show up there, right? Instead of not showing anything, you can give a hint of where to look for information, let people absorb it. Here is an example of animation. Again, no gray, this is terrible, but you can see how it is much better than not showing anything, right? Like you can see, okay, there will be something here, here are the stats that we're going to have, and you kind of prepare yourself for doing the amazing Megachunker watching session. Over time, effectively what it does, it allows a user to process the layout information up front, right? Understand the meaning of the page, be ready for the content. Again, if you can show data sooner, please do. Don't just delay your content, right? Like for no good reason. But if you have to, help a person understand the layout sooner, overall level of frustration will go down, the time to complete the task will go down, they can perform their mission much faster. Here's an example where, God, this is terrible. I'm very sorry, but I'll describe what happens. Before the content shows up, in the top corner, the circle was right here, and a few lines in the corner. Basically, your standard wavy gray box thing that we all know. And maybe you didn't know what skeletal designs meant, but you did have seen those like fake content kind of gray boxes there, right? And I'm sorry, it's not showing up. I apologize. But the point is, remember, we wanted to allocate the space, give spatial recognition to a person, spatial orientation. So don't shift things around. That's not the purpose of it. Don't just slap on the gray boxes. And same goes here. Okay, this one is a little better. Something shows up at least. Between the blocks of content, don't just show the like two fake things and then replace them with real things. Replace the layout with content. Don't replace fake thing with real, right? Don't just show the person information about how many pieces of content there will be, but also tell them where they will be, right? Where they should be expecting that. Because otherwise, you actually frustrate them more, right? They need to reparse this information, right? They allocated the information to the whatever two blocks at the top, and suddenly they need to rescan the page again. This defeats the purpose of this, right? I mean, one can say that those gray wavy boxes became a staple for a reason. I would say they became a staple because of laziness, because we just slapped it on, right? Like, they're like, oh, easy performance solution. Well, don't make easy performance solution. Design your solution, right? And last but not least, yeah, don't use the spinners. If you didn't have a chance to grab a sticker, there are some stickers over there. I am guilty, this is a new laptop. I didn't put the sticker on it yet, I apologize, but effectively, do not use an indicator that tells the user that we know it's slow and we don't know how long it will take. Because this is what this thing does, right? This is a logo of our Speed Patterns website, but replace it with better indication of progress, some maybe transitions, some better progress indications through indicators or skeletal designs, which is one of them, right? Like, think about it this way. Again, this will be the next article on the website, not finished yet. I hope to put more information into it. But basically, think of it as a set of patterns. Develop more and more of those patterns. Patterns are only there to simplify the conversation when you want to pass the knowledge to another person. But generally, think about the designing for speed, right? You will then build to what you design. And maybe some of those assumptions of, oh yeah, show me everything right away. I mean, we need to be realistic about it, right? But be diligent and be explicit about what you want to be built, and then build it. Thank you. Any questions? Alex?
Maybe you're not question as comment.
Okay.
So from my completely different experience, I like idea, but that is also a little bit tricky idea because, for example, designer will say, first put menu, then put picture, and then engineer need to do that. But maybe it's not optimal decision. Or maybe actually this could be asynchronous and throw whenever it throw.
Yeah.
So there is important part maybe, and there are technical part which actually depends on technology, how to do better.
Correct.
That may
correct.
be.
And definitely, this definitely happens. I mean, I practiced this quite a bit already, and this definitely happens. And that's why I'm calling for conversation. Right? I'm like, you saw that cycle of development. For some reason, it's not happening with design as much. You probably all know that designers like throwing all those oil paintings over the wall. Well, slide them back and say, we need the video. Sorry, right? But the reality is that I've seen the opposite as well, where designers don't define it, and developers solve it in their way. They slap on something, like from design system, they slap that gray box or that spinner on, or they optimize for something they think more important rather than what business thinks more important. I mean, we all seen that, right? Like, what was it? Anti-flicker scripts. I don't know if any of you managed that, saw that. It was some of our Meet for Speeds. People came like, why is my carousel and my content on my main page doesn't show up until very late? And we're like, well, it looks like you coded it that way. You literally put a piece of code into your page to accomplish this, and once everything loaded, you faded in. Like, you did that, right? So, effectively, it's a question of conversation. Yes, asking them to give you videos is obviously not going to do the trick, because they will say, you know what they will say to you, right? Instead of our Photoshop and established process, you're telling us to create videos. No. It's not about literally following this. It's about starting the conversation early, so by the time you are in production, you fixed all of that. You implemented the problem.
So danger is if you ask to define everything, they will define, but probably they will define not in an optimal way. So it could be.
At the moment it doesn't match the engineer's thinking, that's where conversation starts, and you start discussing it. That's good example.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to what was said in the presentation earlier about internal advocacy, and like, it's more about building a culture of performance rather than just like making it a step on the cycle.
Just creating a new deliverable that no one knows how to
right.
create is not a solution. Jeff.
I mean, as like an engineer, and I know you work for a lot of different companies, this might be a little aside the topic, but do you find yourself like telling them how to code, or do you find yourself giving them, like if you know, like if you work for a lot of clients and they have a lot of different technologies, you might have a WordPress client, you might have someone who does Next.js, but do you ever try to help them with their code specifically, and do you ever provide them with a template to help them achieve those goals? Sorry, it's
If you attended my presentation last time, you would know that changing your architectures is very hard.
Right, context.
Watch the video on YouTube.
Context switching.
But I find myself recommending the business solution. And I find myself helping them go towards it and seeing where the current solution or architecture or framework doesn't match that. Right? Effectively, I tried to rename my position to speed designer in LinkedIn. Recruiters don't have a clue, so like it's problematic. But generally, you help the business to solve the problem they have, not just technology aspect. So what I found, however, and that's why I persisted on this path of speed design work and some of my UX capture work, if any of you have seen that, was that when you walk into product managers and designers' door and start talking in these business terms, they're like, sure, they have the answers for you. They're sold on it, right? Sure, they need like some, convincing about like correlation numbers and stuff like that. For that, we have math, right? But they actually thought of what's the most important thing to show up first. Is that my logo? Huh, I wonder why. Like, right? They know it. They do marketing. They understand it. So I found that it was much easier to talk to them and convince them that showing their product to the user is quite important because they designed it. They wanted it to be delivered to the user.
How much of many of those concepts are like technology agnostic,
You can fuck it up in any language.
Right.
So I think they are
Great
technology agnostic. Are they physics agnostics? No, right? Like you cannot, as we know, you cannot ship a single page React application and render it as fast as you can ship HTML because of physics. Less bytes, over network, less computation, order of computation is different, right? Like, whatever its server is JavaScript, Rust, WebAssembly, doesn't matter, right? So obviously some choices are more limited than others, right?
Thank you.
Hey, full disclosure, I'm from Cloudinary, so we deal with this on a daily basis. But I just have a couple of questions. So the first one is, aside from all the code that you're working on the page, do you see folks using some of the newer image formats like AVIF and JPEG XL to really get that last sort of bit of performance, especially with image and video heavy pages? Like
I definitely did a lot of conversations,
Yeah.
some of them using Cloud.
Yeah.
So effectively, when we talk about businesses where imagery is top priority resource, like e-commerce, nobody reads the description. They all look at photos. I've been at Etsy. That was known fact. If you've been an Etsy seller, you'll be like, where do you put my description of my product? Right? So anyway, the image is the top priority, right? And some of those physics can only be achieved by better formats, for fewer bytes, by, maybe progressive JPEG was like a more complicated question, but like formats that allow for this to happen. In fact, oftentimes in Meet for Speed sessions, we are like, okay, you put such a rich image here in the background of your text, but it's not the priority content. That was just a better background. Why didn't you have a single color background placeholder first, so while the image loads, your text is still visible? This was like a very common, I don't know if any of you dialed into our Meet for Speed, but that's like a common thing. So you solve a product question, and yes, oftentimes imagery is big there, and yeah, responsive images, better formats, video versus images, progressive enhancements, carousels. I actually have a couple of hidden slides about how to do better carousels, you know, how a carousel is not a carousel first, it's actually just one image and then it becomes a carousel, and things like that. But so not all of it is a format question. I understand that cloud engineering in particular is in the business of formatting, real-time transcoding, things like that, and as a solution it fits very well, but sometimes you might want to think outside the box as well and think of what is that the person creating an image tries to achieve, or maybe at least they should be trying to achieve, because that's enough.
The second question I have though is, do you find that customers are leveraging CDNs or multiple CDNs more with their projects or not?
CDNs for sure.
Yeah.
Again, the customer depends on the customer.
Yeah.
Right? But CDNs for sure. Multiple CDNs is often reserved or reasonably reserved to larger companies, like Etsy, you know, where like to them the volume is just so high they cannot afford just one. Or so yes, definitely CDNs. If you ask a JavaScript developer what CDN is, they will tell you that's where the JavaScript is downloaded from. So be careful using the word CDN. Like you actually need to explain what that means. But and by the way, for those of you who are not familiar, it's content delivery network. It's a solution that can deliver requests closer to the user, and therefore makes it faster. It's not just another thing to host your JavaScript on. It can do it to every asset, including images, and including your HTML, by the way, folks. That's the CNN example I gave. They're definitely serving that 146 millisecond HTML from a CDN. Like, there's no way they would do it in any other way.
How often do you guys use market research groups before implementing the features? Like banners or buttons?
I worked at a couple of companies that used market research or user testing. So it's like, they're like bigger businesses in the past were doing multi-month market research, then they brought it into designers. That never worked really, you know, it's all bullshit. But user research of rapid iteration, definitely. That's being used. I know folks at Meetup were actually big proponents of that. In fact, Tammy Everts, who I didn't mention by the name, but she is one of the co-creators of WPO Stats together with Sinkalik, and she's also the author of Time is Money book that was on that slide earlier. She actually did a lot of research and user experience research, and she was at Radware when, well, before that it was a different company. Anyway, they did some research trying to see how they can capture performance understanding from those interviews. And it is not a straightforward thing to do, right? They used some interesting things like word clouds to try to capture slow versus fast experience and what people perceive. Because they will not tell you it's slow or like, oh, it was 10 milliseconds this or 10 milliseconds that. But they will tell you that the quality is low, right? And things like that. So that research was pretty amazing. They did some brain scanning techniques to try to measure this. It was amazing. Check out her book. We were giving it away in the past, but we ran out. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I love your idea about the immutable layout, and my question is about whether using, you know, placeholders and then replacing them with the actual content is in fact better than those spinners that you don't recommend when it comes to scenarios when the connection is simply slow and the user must wait, and so that they see the placeholders for longer than you would like.
So do you think it's better to give them a clue of what's coming, or not to give a clue and distract them with
I don't know. My question is
Yeah.
more about like, have you measured this, or do you know?
No, I haven't measured it. No. I don't think there is much research that went into any of this so far in the industry, right? So what I'm showing is effectively the techniques that people agreed on without necessarily knowing how, right? Just placeholders, probably not enough, right? Universally. It probably depends on how long it takes as well. So I know some research was done by Pivotal, and Nicole Sullivan gave a talk about it like about 10 years ago here in New York, and she was talking about, how was it called? Optimistic rendering, for example. So if something would, if they know for sure that the VM will actually boot up for 100% certainty, right? Like Pivotal is hosting provider like Amazon was, like maybe on a higher abstraction level, you know, and they have a button to launch a VM. They can show the check mark that it's complete, or they can show the completion or like in progress state. The operation has started, or they can show the check mark if they know it will take a little bit of time, but it will definitely happen, right? And if it doesn't, they can fall back for something. So speculative rendering. Also, I think they literally collected timing from production, how long it takes, and depending on different timing, they would either not have progress indicator, like the progress bar, or they will have a progress bar, right? And use that timing as a baseline of how fast things go, right? Because some things we don't know how long it will take, right? Like, sure, we don't know, but do we have an idea? Can we give a little bit of a hint? You know, I mean, nobody likes the Windows progress bar when it installs, right? But it's better than nothing, right? Actually, Alex, my son, who's a gamer as well, showed me an amazing technique from Game World, where in the games, if you go from one episode to another, you usually go into the door and there is a tunnel. And as you walk through the tunnel, it loads the next level, right? The fact of you walking through the tunnel doesn't give you interactivity, it doesn't give you a lot of visual effect, but it can render something while the result shows. And yes, those techniques can be used effectively, right? Just don't use the speed. Just don't use the speed. Yeah, Alex.
Do you want me to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, please.
So the technique he's mentioning is, I've heard it often called disguised loading screens. It's actually not a very recent, it's actually been around for a while now, but before, a lot of that time in games, which required you to transfer levels, you would reach a spot, it would cut to like black sometimes even. Different loading screen had it done differently, but you would have maybe some kind of spinner again. You would have a spinner in the corner with a black screen while the level was figuring it out and loading the next place. Something companies began to do is you would be running around, you went through an action sequence, next level is coming up, and you know, like geographically in the world, you're like going someplace else, right? So instead of like cutting to black as you reach like a doorstep or something, or you reach a ravine, you can have a player go through like a narrow crevice, and here's another important part of it is they actually have to like click forward, or if they're using a controller, they hold forward to tell your character, you know, keep going forward. So what's happening is your character, because they're squeezing through a tight space, for example, they're going slow, so you have to keep going forward, and you don't see much because you're in a crevice, right? And because you don't see much, your old level can unload, because that's what you're leaving, and you don't see behind you. And the new level, you don't quite see all of it yet, you see like a light at the end of the crevice. You don't actually see anything. So they can load up all the assets, have it all ready once you exit, and you can start playing right away. So the players, psychologically, it feels like there was no loading screen. You just had to, like, you know, move through something.
And they were occupied, right? So the interaction did happen, right?
Exactly.
So, like it wasn't an idle time. In fact, I want to point out there was a great talk some years ago. I don't remember exactly. I can look it up by Josh Fuchs, I think. I might be messing up the first name. He was talking about the difference between idle time and active time of the user, right? Where you want the user to be active. And spinners don't create that, but more, like his example that he gave were much more interactive transition items, like the button will like expand or collapse or like do some magic like that occupied the person's attention, which obviously didn't create any speed up, right? But it involved the user to pay attention, to be interacting with the thing, which basically didn't start the frustration counter, right? Which with black screen would.
So I think two cents on that. If you want to see an excellent execution of this,
Yeah.
the Uncharted games.
Okay.
I went to a talk at GDC in like 2009, and they talk about there are 0 loading screens in the game unless you die. So if you can make it through that game, you will never see a loading screen.
Yeah, there you go.
It's
And by the way,
it's incentive.
game developers battled with this problem since before, right? We had like basically they are the ones who gave us GPU cards and better computing power because they tried to fit the experience into very constrained hardware since the beginning of, well, how Americans know computing. Russians didn't play as much. Americans did. No, I can tell stories. Okay, Alex.
So can we get to a first couple of slides that was metrics?
Yeah.
Without your meetups,
You mean this one or?
in the beginning.
Oh, like, oh, I see. This one. With this one, right?
No, with
Oh, you mean this?
APN or something.
Sorry. No. This one?
No. This is a couple of Google metrics.
Oh, I think slide 5.
Maybe.
Slide 5?
Yeah.
Oh, this one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I look like a little bit behind.
Yeah. Okay.
Could you explain what exactly showed on first one and second one, and how they are related between each other?
Yeah. So those are three different groups. One is loading, interactivity, and visual stability. Those are categories of metrics that Google thinks are impacting performance. And in each of those categories, they pick the top metric that they want to measure with. Like they basically did as much research as they could to figure out the best one. In fact, previous team mentioned that FID was replaced with INP metrics, like as the main representative, right? So those are metrics, and for each user, if this metric was below this threshold, it's considered good. And Google will say, perfect, your site should be boosted. If all three, by the way, false. If all three were green, it will be boosted, right? And vice versa, right? Poor, 4 and up is bad, and this needs improvement. And that's how they signal to website owners in no uncertain terms, you should be green or you don't get the benefit. Right? And obviously, specific metric has their own way of measuring this, right? Like LCP is one way, INP measures interactivity, CLS measures visual stability, things like that.
Okay, so first I think I understand that kind of where you paint most of it, yeah? In some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're more positive about it than I am. Yes.
But second, previous presentation and this one, I still missing how it relates to the, we paint something already. How we get to
Yeah,
second one?
this is related to interactivity. As user interacts with the page itself. And obviously my patterns didn't cover this at all, right? Like they probably should, like, as you define design of your interactivity, you probably should pay attention to it. It's like, I just didn't put any patterns yet. I mean, I still have 8 to write up for them just showing things, right? But effectively, if user's interaction is unpleasant, and in our case it's janky, right, as you scroll, the page doesn't scroll very well, if you press a button, things just don't happen fast enough, or for whatever reason, right? This is the metric that you will use.
So what it means, for example, if you have link on page and one coming to next page.
Yep.
So
Yep.
what exactly?
Interaction between 2 pages is a little more complicated. In fact, I don't think INP measures that, right?
It does.
It does?
ATAG. Yeah, just not necessarily the target page.
Okay,
But
yeah.
yeah,
It's complicated
it's-
because which page you attribute it to and all of that. But between pages might be a more complicated question. I might need to research in more detail. But if you try to open a menu on a page and it takes time to open, it literally measures the next pane, right? The next frame in the browser being painted. So it means it waits for JavaScript to kick in, JavaScript to run, whatever else needs to happen. Maybe you are making a network request to fetch the data for that drop down, right? And then you paint, that's what it measures. It's
So
advanced.
basically, if we want to scroll and click to scroll it down, so when it might actually scroll, that would be And
Correct, correct. But again, for some cases, you care a lot about the JavaScript execution, right? For example, you have some background ad or whatever, like, or video playing, and suddenly your main thread is frozen, right? That's kind of most of what the team discussed, right? You parallelize JavaScript, things like that. But in some cases, it's literally, you literally ask the network to make a request and wait for it to come back. That's like poor API design, poor performance design, without necessarily having JavaScript being a problem. JavaScript is still a big problem, but at least like, in this case it was you, right? So it's not always the same answer to those, but so obviously network requests will not stop your scrolling necessarily, but the drop down will not open, right? It's still a problem, just of a different kind.
if I remember correctly, there was metrics like time to interactivity.
Those are the older ones that this basically replaces.
But say large content paint sounds that it may paint, but it will, you cannot interact with
Correct.
it.
I mean, ask every SPA application, like how long it takes between even server-side rendered application before you paint everything and when you can press a button. How many megabytes is your React tab? How much it takes to load? Yeah, that's obviously like basically the same age-old problem that we've been dealing with all these years. We just found a little bit better metric, better attribution in the browser, by the way. That's like browsers are reporting well. At this point, all of these metrics are only reported by Chromium-based browsers. Safari doesn't support them. Sorry, my bad. Firefox supports some of them, but not all of them. But Safari doesn't. Yeah.
Would you say that prefetching is kind of a band-aid solution to all of this? Or is that a strategy?
Well, it depends on what you prefetch, but yeah. By the way, I'm a Google developer expert. Thank you, thank you. I just attended Google I/O and saw the latest announcements, and maybe you followed online. One feature landed actually in February. It's speculation rules. Prefetching and pre-rendering, actually. You can actually tell the browser explicitly, hey, pre-render this page, this next page. And when user clicks on it, it will literally just reveal pre-rendered page with some caveats about third-party execution and stuff like that, right? So, Band-Aid, everything can be a Band-Aid solution, especially if you're prefetching the wrong thing. You would be surprised how often that happens. You know, our font performance conversation had a few funny examples where, yeah, you load a lot, you're prefetching a lot of fonts or images, and well, the browser didn't use those. Why, right? So everything can be in Band-Aid, but if used properly, most of them, except for the spinner, can be used well. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.